Thank you. Yeah, Toby Zimmer, Senior Director in Data Protection. Been in the cybersecurity space over 25 years, been data protection focused for the last 17. Actually my second year in a row presenting at RSA, so appreciate you coming out here and hearing what we have to say, talk about how we deal with protecting sensitive information. Yeah. Jordan?
Yeah, excellent. If we want to jump to the next slide. One of the things you will hear, especially as we start talking through different aspects of a data disposition framework, there's a lot of tangential parts from both a legal standpoint, from an industry best practices standpoint. So you just want to say, this conversation is to be educational. We are not providing legal advice on any particular matter, but really, hopefully, as we go through, especially we have some time at the end for Q&A, feel free to ask any questions about what you've heard, and we can really go back and forth and dialogue a little bit more about the topic. So from an agenda standpoint, what we're really going to be looking to cover is, what are some of the drivers for getting better control and management around our data? You can think of it as, data lifecycle management, master data management, even just looking at regulatory requirements. But one of the big things is, what are the drivers, both from an industry standard standpoint, but also some of the regulatory drivers that are out there. And then, the next piece is really how do we start approaching identifying relevant data, right? Our sensitive data, where's it at? How's it being used? What kind of controls and protection requirements do we have in place or need to have in place? And then finally, we are going to get in a little bit into building a data disposition matrix or framework. One of the things I want to start with, from just a show of hands across the room, has anyone here been a part of doing like a data inventorying or building a data disposition framework? Okay, excellent. So quite a bit of people have. That's good. So one of the things that as we go through, I'd love to hear some lessons learned as we go. Definitely what we're saying is just what we've seen typically work a little more, we'll say, long-term success-wise with particular clients. But we'll be diving into just some examples really for how we build this space. And one thing I like to hit on too is we're going to talk a lot about the data disposition framework as it relates to sensitive data and then really putting retention or encryption controls in place or a blend thereof. This can be very customizable, right? If you were to look at GDPR out of Europe, Article 30, records of processing activities, they refer to as a data inventory. But it's a very similar concept. It's what do you have? How sensitive is it? How's it being used? What controls are in place? Really think master data management themes. So while we are giving a pretty specific example around retention and encryption as part of the data disposition framework, it can really be designed and customized to meet whatever use case we're trying to solve. And then finally, we'll have closing remarks.
So this is a very practical session. There's a lot of things we're going to focus on in terms of how you actually go about building the data disposition framework. How do you go out and define and identify data elements? I will encourage you all to download this presentation because there's a lot of content in the appendix that provides sample workflows, sample disposition frameworks, sample questions to ask. So again, very practical approach what we're going to leverage here. And as we go through this, there's a lot of things that we as an organization deal with when trying to protect sensitive information. Part of the learning objectives here today is start to develop an understanding of how do you go out and actually identify what this information is. How do you start thinking about identifying what those data elements look like? Second part of this is breaking down the specific data sources, the data use cases, and the business owners that are using it, and understand how is information used as part of our normal business processes. And lastly, you walk away from this having the foundational understanding of how do you develop the framework? How do you start to put these different components together, data elements, business requirements, retention schedules, and actually build out a functional framework. So we're going to spend a little bit of time here. We want to spend a lot more time focusing on how do you actually do this. But it's important to understand we set a little bit of context up front. So what's driving the need to use information? Why are organizations keeping it? Well, as you start this journey, it's really important to understand that there's a number of reasons why organizations keep information around. There's a number of different things from a business operations perspective and from a financial perspective, as well as regulatory perspective, that organizations need to keep data. The first thing is financial growth. We're in the business of making money, unless you work for a nonprofit. But ideally, we need information to understand how are we performing, how do we generate greater revenue, and how do we actually make the company more profitable. Secondary aspect of this is innovation. How do we develop new products? If we don't have that information to understand where we're at, where we need to go, it's a critical driver for us to be able to develop the next generation of products, be be innovative in the space. And lastly is regulatory requirements. There's a number of regulations out there that require us to keep data for a minimum amount of time. Now, that's not all data. There are specific types of data these regulations are going to require you to keep around, which Jordan's going to go into here in a minute. Secondary aspect, if we look at this from an operational perspective, is common sense, right? We want to do things more efficiently. I need to reduce operating costs. So whether that's getting a better asking price for materials we use for production, getting greater efficiencies out of our employees, that type of information is really important. We need data to make those decisions. Acquiring new companies and acquiring new customers. So if I want to go in and expand into a market, how do I get there? How do I make it a compelling reason to do it? And then lastly, there's compliance reasons why we have to have this around. Doing audits. There are things from a legal perspective. We have to keep information around. So as you think about this, consider how these topics are going to influence the way you actually start to formulate and build the data elements, the types of information you own, and ultimately how you start to form up a data disposition framework. Jordan.
Yeah. Excellent. So, from an industry and regulatory standpoint, and I'm sure many people in the room have seen this, right? If you look regulation by regulation, it is a patchwork of retention schedules. Really if you look at legacy regulations in particular, most of the focus has been, you need to retain this data up to this point, right? What we're seeing with some of the new modern age regulations is a little bit of that, but also, you must maintain data up to this point, but not beyond this point, right? So we're really when we start talking about retention schedules, this is where we work with a lot of legal teams and compliance groups on, where is that sweet spot? Because we know we need to retain data for a certain point, but then we need to ensure we don't keep it beyond another said point. So moral of the story is there's obviously a lot of complexity when it comes to just building a retention schedule. I can't tell you how many times Toby and I get on calls with clients and we start talking through, what are you trying to accomplish? Well, one of the things we think we can nail is getting a retention schedule defined and then rolled out, right? And in relatively short order. It is not the easiest thing to do because, for example, right, this slide talks about the different year durations you need to retain data for. But you can even get into, when does the clock start? Right? Does it start on creation date, last modified date, last access date? So one of the things we really like to focus on in particular when we start talking about even just building a data retention schedule, which a lot of people think is very simple. There's a lot of nuance to it. But ensuring that one, we're not the sole group making the determination, right? It's usually something that's going to sit with legal, compliance, maybe even risk, but there's obviously a group that's going to operationalize it. Usually that is going to be the security team, the information management team. I used to, in multiple prior lives, I was in the General Counsel's Office at Western Union, and I focused very solely on information management and international record retention schedules. It is, when I said complex, I can't remember the country, I think it was Ukraine, maybe, that had a health or HR retention schedule that was 75 years past the point of termination, right? So there's a lot of nuance. Moral of the story is going back to really being able to define across the business unit and having different groups that we're working with on both defining the retention schedule, but also how are we going to roll it out, right? And that's really where the complexity can be really easily defined in a strategy, but building through the nuance of how we're going to roll it out is really where organizations tend to struggle, and that's where we think a data disposition framework helps with that's kind of starting point. So a little bit for, little reasons why businesses keep data. I think probably everyone in the new room knows this, so I'm not going to beat on it too much, but the more and more we are moving into the modern age, obviously our data footprint grows significantly. A lot of value being kept in that data, right? So whether it be for strategic planning purposes, market analysis, right? What are our consumers buying and purchasing more regularly, doing a little more targeted development, even if it's ad creation, looking at new products and services. And then one of the things that I like the most is this bottom row of things, because this is stuff that is often overlooked. Usually when you're defining a retention schedule, legal usually has some weight in that conversation for how we're going to build the overall strategy as it relates to retaining business for the organization. We often run through scenarios where, say, we find data that's beyond the retention schedule. What's the process for beginning the purge? When you really get into the weeds, in particular with clients, a lot of the time things like legal holds or data that's on a legal hold is missed because it's not really something that the operational team is focused on. It's really something legal is defining the requirements for. So and it can really, when saying about litigation, investigation, statutes of limitations in particular, when we're in client sites helping them fill out their data disposition framework, a large piece of that is what is our legal hold strategy as well, right? Are we putting a data owner on legal hold because we can't segregate the system, or are we actually pulling that legal hold data, that's relevant data, out and putting it in a completely segregated repository? So when we start talking through the strategy for retention, like I've said a few times now, but getting to that data disposition framework, we really need to have a lot of belts and braces in place to ensure that when we do start remediating on the data that we have discovered that's beyond a retention schedule, we're not going to run into legal consequences as purging data that should be retained on a legal hold. And where is that data being held? So a little bit about the operational reasons, right? Productivity, huge piece. Manufacturing, uptime, reliability. This is just the belts and braces, right? Most, I would assume most people in the room kind of realize that the data that we have, especially from an operational standpoint, crucial data. There's always a valid justification for retaining it. Sometimes that justification needs to be scrutinized a little bit, but operational data is going to be crucial for making informed business decisions. So we want to, that's obviously going to be a key driver for leadership and really retaining that. One of the things that we focus on, though, in particular, is is there a valid justification for retaining it? I've had many initiatives where we get in and we say, hey, our record retention schedule is 7 years and these 3 applications, but someone, usually a data owner for the application, pushes back and says, hey, we need to keep that data for 10 years, not the 7. Well, why? Well, we're doing a 10-year look back of historical uptime and reliability across our organization in preparations for an M&A activity, right? There are some actual justifications for retaining data beyond the retention schedule. It's just about defining that and having a process to manage it. So a little bit of a few things that I've hit on in particular. When you start to prepare to build this data disposition matrix as a whole, you really need to start getting an understanding of what records are relevant. I and Toby would advertise this as well. Don't try to boil the ocean. Let's start with a business unit or a subset of applications and really start to build out what we know around there and show some success and grow the process as we roll it out across the organization. Another big piece, how's that data being collected? What are we using it for? There's some pieces in here that we'll get to around just doing active data discovery, whether it be from a tooling standpoint or a manual process. But one of the things the tools in this space are not able to tell you is how is that data being used within that particular business unit. That's going to be a huge piece, right? And defining part of the data disposition framework, because that's going to inform what kind of security controls are we going to be putting in place. And then finally, how long are we trying to keep it? Some of the belts and braces of that record retention schedule we've been talking about.
So spend a little bit of time talking about the reasons why information is being kept, some of the justification behind it. Let's get into the weeds here. Let's start talking about how do you actually go out and start identifying what this data is and actually start to break this down into the elements. So again, thinking a little bit more from a data perspective, what are some of the types of data we collect? Starting on the left-hand side, looking at personal information, pretty easy, right? Customer records, employee information. We know what that typically consists of. Name, address, employee number, et cetera. Going down to the financial side, again, accounting records are pretty easy to understand. It's accounts payable, accounts receivable, cost of goods sold, sales forecast, what's our gross revenue, what's our net revenue, et cetera. Pretty structured, pretty easy to find. As you start to get into some of the more complex data, it's important to realize that this is information that we have to dig into the data owners to understand what does this look like. Compliance reports are not a standard thing. Neither are anything around the legal side. And legal, as Jordan pointed out earlier, is a lot more complex. There's a lot of stuff that can't be disclosed, and that information is very fluid. Design drawings, source code, things around mergers, acquisitions, and divestitures, that data is very fluid, very sensitive. So it's really difficult to understand, just looking at it from a raw data perspective, it's really challenging. But if we start to understand what are the major elements behind what that data looks like, that's going to help us start to get to this point of understanding what is our information. We as cybersecurity practitioners can't tell you what that information is. I've been in this space a long time. I know what a lot of information looks like, but you put me in front of a company, I've got a general idea. I can't tell you the nuances of it. That's why I need to look at who owns it. That's a real important part of this, and as Jordan pointed out as well, this is a partnership. We need to understand and start to work with these folks. And ultimately, the data owner is going to be the person who tells us how sensitive this is. Those are the key foundational things we need to think about here in order to start to build out this framework. Second aspect of this is understanding who owns this information, how's it used, where's it going. So as we look at the first part of this, the questions you need to start asking and start thinking about is, first part, who are the departments, the groups, the data owners we need to partner up with? How do we identify who these people are? Second thing to think about is, where are we getting this information from? If you look at the way we get data nowadays, it comes in from multiple sources. We can be developing stuff internally. It could be coming in from another department, a sister or parent company. We could be getting data from third parties who are giving us from an external feed. It's really important to understand where this information comes from so that we can start to identify, again, what it is. Second set of questions to think about is, how does this data support the business? This requires us to be inquisitive. We have to start to understand from a business perspective, how do these groups use this information? What are those workflows? What are those processes? How is it moving around? And also taking a look at how is it being transferred and stored. Again, we have cloud sources, we have on-prem sources, we have third parties. Data's going everywhere. Data's being stored everywhere. So we now understand where the information is, who's using it, how it's used, where it's stored. Big question here is, how valuable is it? What value does the organization gain from this? And this can get very complex. But again, this is where we have to partner with the business to understand, how much value does this have? One of the other questions that we have to think about here and ask is, data today is not as valuable as data 5 years from now. Most data is going to depreciate in value. And it's going to be important for the business to tell us that. Last thing, as we start looking at protecting information, we're thinking about changing it from a cybersecurity perspective, whether that's encrypting it, deleting it, anonymizing it, what have you. If I do that, how's that going to impact the business? How's that going to impact the data set? If I change the data set, I break it. I can make it useless, or I can skew the results. I was working with a large tech company here a couple years ago in the Bay Area, 100 petabytes of data in the cloud. 50 of it was personal information. That's a lot, particularly when I'm looking at GDPR and CCPA at the time. It's a lot of data. And as we started to dig into it, we found out there's like 20 different business units inside of this organization. And they all had various different reasons why they needed it. Some of it, as we talked about earlier, was around fraud prevention, order tracking. Some of the stuff that the marketing units were using it for was where it got a little challenging. So data is not created equally. And there may be a very legitimate reason for one group to use it, keep it around for a while. There may be another reason why they may not be able to keep it. So we need to think about that and start to put that into context as we build out this disposition framework. So, Jordan.
Yeah, well, I think too, before we get too far into the weeds on this, one of the things that probably is understated in this effort, this is going to require a lot of time from different people across the organization. I kind of some of the points Toby talked about, defining data owners. That's going to be a first start, right? Just an idea of who was responsible for this data set. But then going through the actual review of how's this data being used, what business functions are actually touching it, for what's the purpose, right? It is a manual effort that does take some time, care, and feeding. Often, people have trouble getting leadership to buy into that. They don't see a lot of revenue benefits. They don't see a whole lot of big picture for how does this actually help us drive the business forward. But one of the big things, kind of, I think, Toby, you were kind of hitting on this a second ago, is from a just data hygiene standpoint, cleanup, right? That, especially in the cloud environment, that storing data past retention schedule comes at a cost. Right, so I think if you guys are going down a journey like this or have discussions with it, it's a good thing to talk to leadership about. This is not just a compliance activity. This is not just a risk reduction activity. This is a cost analysis as well. How much data do we have beyond a retention schedule? What is that costing us on a yearly basis? So, broader kind of conversation topics to get more buy-in at the executive level. And just one fun stat. This is a little data, it's from 2020, but if you had C-suite buy-in for an initiative like this, it was 87% successful. If you did not, it was 17% successful, right? So having leadership advocate for doing something in this vein allows people to free up a little daytime, little recovery from the hours at work to actually help support it. So just a fun little thing to kind of consider is that leadership buy-in is obviously very crucial in the success of running a data disposition framework. So, some key things to ask, right? Obviously, ingress points and how we collect data, crucial component, but really one of the things that's often understated is probably working with your procurement team and looking at the contracts. What are the contractual requirements for retaining it outside of some of the regulatory aspects as well? One of the big things is for the data we collect, how long are we keeping it? There's some terms of use within contracts, but also, with some of the relationships with third parties, like data brokers in particular, they also have some stipulations on your third-party transfers after the collection point, as well as, how long are you going to be retaining this data? Can the information be altered without corrupting the data, right? So there may be pieces or subsets, say something's on a legal hold, for example, a record in particular. That whole thing needs to be retained, right, from a chain of custody standpoint, from a legal purview. So are we able to actually alter that data, or do we need to retain it in its current state and format usually for a legal hold? And then, is there sufficient justification for retaining that data? I said this earlier, I think whoever is usually leading this initiative, there is a fiduciary duty, if you will, to scrutinize what people are saying. They're both from a use standpoint, from a secondary or tertiary use standpoint, but also just, does this make sense? I've had many, and as much as I love marketing teams, sometimes marketing teams like to keep a lot of data for just trending over the years. It's not often not meeting a sufficient justification, right? And to Toby's point, data, the value of data starts to reduce pretty quickly in our current age. So when people come to me and say, hey, we've got 12 years of data here, we want to keep it. Well, yeah, how valuable is 9 of it, right? That really being able to scrutinize what the justification for retaining that information is.
So just one thing to chime in on here, you'll notice in some of these slides, there's an appendix slide. We actually have a sample workflow for this in the back. This will take you through the steps on how you start to ask these questions and formulate some of the decisions you're going to make around the disposition framework. Slide before as well, there's another workflow in the back there that's going to talk more about this. So by all means, again, look at the appendix. There's a lot more details in the back end.
Excellent. So one thing, when we start talking about preparing to build, you guys heard me say this a little bit already, at Optiv, I lead the data governance, data privacy, data protection practice. I like push this into a governance viewpoint, because if you really think about data, sensitive data, it is a governance component. What we are doing is identifying how risky is our data sets, how sensitive are we keeping stuff, or how sensitive is the data we have in our custody, where is it at, how's it being used, what controls are in place, where are we transferring it, right? It touches on a lot of different aspects. There's privacy concerns that were just referenced in there. There's data protection concerns that are just referenced in there. So when you think about data governance as a whole, right, data is everywhere within an organization. You need a cross-conglomerate group of individuals to make decisions on that data. And to be frank, right, no one group should be determining how data is managed across the organization. So what we really try to focus on when we are going to build the data disposition framework, bringing in data owners across the organization. I like to do them by business units. It's from a starting standpoint. But then starting to look at the justification for using data. That starts to scrutinize not only how are you collecting it, what's the primary use. So we're going to look at a privacy notice if it's third-party data or employee data. So is that matching up with what we disclaimed we were collecting data for? But then also what are the secondary and the tertiary uses of this data? Types of data being used, right? Sensitivity level is a big thing. We're going to get into some information here in a little while, but having personal information of just Jordan, right? That's, while it could be deemed personal data, not overly sensitive, because there's a million Jordans in the world. But when we start talking about Jordan, McClintock, date of birth, phone number, right, we start to have a higher sensitivity level associated with that, which means we need to have better protection controls in place. Data elements in use, kind of talked about that a little bit already. Opportunities to anonymize data, and I think there's especially if you look at both the international and domestic privacy regulations, anonymization, pseudo-anonymization, really a key area of focus as it relates to personal data components. So one of the things we like to look at is from a just risk management standpoint, is there an opportunity to anonymize some of this data set? And essentially that kind of gets back to, do we have a valid justification for keeping it? And then approximate time when you can dispose of it, right? Getting everyone understanding for this particular application, holding this data, this is when you can purge it. One of the things I like about this in particular, we run into a lot of, well, what do I do when Toby leaves the organization? He's in charge of the data disposition framework. He was telling us, when do we need to purge stuff? build some resiliency, right? Put it in that data disposition framework. This is how long you're keeping it. After this period, dispose of it. Here's the mechanisms that you can dispose of it with. So that's usually where these are some of the key areas where we're going to start when we start building out a data disposition framework.
So we've been talking a lot about data disposition frameworks. Let's build one. Let's go through the steps here. So the first part of this, Jordan.
Yeah, so the first part, really, obviously you can, like I said at the very first this will be customized for really whatever you are trying to accomplish relates to data management, compliance. We're sticking with retention. So, for some of the first key things to ask, data element, what's the kind of type of data and some of its sensitivity level? Is it sensitive by itself? Or if it's married with another data set or type of data or data element, does the sensitivity level increase? And then, what is the process for actually managing that? And then from there, we really started getting into, what are our retention requirements? We've already discussed when data can be destroyed. Another big piece for this example, encryption controls. Are we, fully encrypting, tokenizing, masking, pseudo-anonymization? So really, what is our overall process from a control standpoint as relates to de-identifying the information? And then if we're using anonymization, what is that method? And we can also, when we start getting into this space, we start looking at access management as well. Who needs access to the sensitive information? But an example of kind of what we talked about, right? Just having street address, not necessarily going to be personal data. And under current regulation, personal data is anything that can be directly or indirectly related back to an individual. A little broader than our typical definitions of PII, right? This is, that indirect linkability piece is crucial. So like an employee ID, your IP address, right? That is going to be personal data under regulatory requirements now, so we need to make sure we're at least accommodating for it with some additional controls. But to the point I'm trying to make is having one data element does not necessarily raise the sensitivity level. It's when you start marrying it with other data points to make a record, right? So that's really what we're going to be looking at is the difference between a data element versus a sensitive data record.
So let's take a look at an example here. This is what we've done here in this particular setup is I've got my data elements on the bottom, on the left-hand side, and run across the top. And as Jordan mentioned earlier, some of the stuff by itself is not necessarily sensitive. I start combining these things together. Yeah, it can become identifiable. It can become referenceable. I want to make sure we discern between the two. Identifiable deals primarily with personal information. Referenceable is I start taking a look at things around manufacturing or intellectual property. If I can infer something that I'm going to be developing from an IP perspective, same type of thing. Now, again, this two vector opportunity, it's pretty simple. First name, last name, very sensitive information under some regulations. What if we're not dealing with that? Well, this is an example of how you can take this and start to put together these different types of categories. And again, you can call this categorization, you can call this reference number, what have you. But as I start to combine things together, things start to become more identifiable. In this particular case, as I'm using a category 1 and category 2 here, I'm saying if I've got, in this example, street address, and I have the gender of a person who lives at that address, that's part of the equation. I'm getting kind of close. But if I tie that back into either the city or the state, I now have something that's pretty referenceable. So this is a way, an example of how you can think about taking these data elements that you're collecting as you're building out this disposition framework and start to build this cross-mapping matrix and start to be able to work with the data owners to understand if I start putting elements together, when does it become sensitive? Because by itself, it may not be. But combined together, I may start creating sensitive information. Let's get into the framework. What are the primary components of a data disposition framework? We've been saying this a lot. We're going to say it again. Defining what those data elements are. Let's go take a look at what's the name of the element. What's the type of information the element is typically found in? What's the sensitivity level? Secondary aspect we're going to look at, and once we go into the framework in the next slide, is what are the business categories? What's the business purpose that we need to do this? We've talked about marketing. We talked about fraud prevention. We talked about customer service. Those are business operations that you may find out that there's multiple groups that use it. Marketing, for example, there's probably 2 or 3 or 4 organizations in your company that may fall into that category. Secondary aspect of this is retention periods. Under each one of these business areas, I'm going to start to think about breaking down what are the typical retention periods I want to have here. And I would typically recommend, if you see the framework in the next slide, start with 3, 1 year, 1 to 3 years, greater than 3 years. You can make it as complex as you want, but typically start with those 3 types of categories from a retention perspective, and that'll give you a better way of starting to determine when do I change information, when do I need to destroy it, when do I need to deprecate it. And lastly, what are the things we can do with that data? Can I encrypt it? Can I anonymize it? Can I tokenize it, et cetera? So Jordan.
Yeah, so this is kind of an example of looking at PII, or personal data in particular, for how do we actually build out a data disposition framework. One of the things I'm going to just say right out the gate, this is an initiative that we're looking for progress, not perfection. If you've undergone one of these efforts, right, it can be pretty substantial. The big piece, when we talk about actually defining this, trying to keep it relatively simple. On the left, you're going to see there's some of the just starting categories, right? Attribute name for the data type, category of data, classification. For this example, we use pretty basic classification. Most of the time, use a 3 to 5 tier system within your site for a classification policy. But this is an easy way to really look at, is this public data or is it private data? And then making actual informed decisions on what controls and retention schedules we're going to put in place. So, for example, right now, we are looking from more of a capability standpoint, looking at the fraud requirements, marketing requirements, warranty requirements. Could be a variety of different activities that we are looking to put retention schedules on. But really, you can do, most of the time, to be very frank, you'll just see a classification or a retention schedule that says this is the day, this is the period with which you need to start purging. What we have seen from more of a, I'll say, success in rolling out a data disposition framework is the more options you can give individuals, they feel like they have a little more control. They usually actually adopt a data disposition framework a little easier. But for example, right, 1 to 3 or less than a year, we're going to keep it and encrypt it. If it's private, if it's public data, right, we don't really need to put any controls in place. But retention does start to apply after the 3 years. So you can kind of see where we'll actually start mapping out based off classification type, what are the controls we're going to put in place? Is this going to be an encrypted actual record? Are we going to just tokenize it? Very dependent on both use cases, why we're kind of talking about up front how that data is being used. There might be activities where you don't want to actually generalize it, you need to tokenize it for a particular business reason. So having those components mapped out is going to be a crucial piece because it's really going to allow us to put a more, I'll say, granular control purview in place to show how we handle specific data elements. And then, obviously, we'll get to destroy. You can build a lot of granularity into the destroy space and saying, maybe we are running SQL scripts to purge it. Maybe we have a tool or a vendor in place that's actually extracting it. Maybe we're completely anonymizing it, and that's being categorized as a destroy. So a lot of different approaches, but it's nice to map it out because in the example I gave of Toby leaving the company, if it's defined, you can hire just the next replacement, right? And have a good idea of what is the overall approach to putting these controls and purging against the retention schedule in place, and not just left with one individual. Then this is an example for manufacturing. So, when we talk about data types in particular, personal data, PII, often used frequently as sensitive data. What I personally think the most value is really your IP. Right, what intellectual property do we have? What is the risk tiering to it? Right, as you can tell, most of this, for this example, is manufacturing and private. So we know that's going to be some of our trade secrets. We want to figure out, what do we not want to be going out the door, or even internal individuals to have access to, and then really starting to map out, what does that retention schedule look like? What's the duration on it? What's the stage or status of that data throughout that life cycle to ensure that we are putting protection controls in place? I personally feel like when you go through an incident or a breach, I've helped quite a few clients on this. If you have something like this, it allows us to meet that 72-hour breach notification period pretty quickly because we know what data was in a particular environment or application and can make the right notifications based off that information. So while we are talking mostly about retention and encryption, kind of my earlier point, you can build this however you really need to. I really like to use it from a breach notification standpoint, because now I know what applications have personal data in particular. Knowing that that personal data was involved in an incident and it was unencrypted, I know I've got some remediation to do with consumers and with regulators, right? So it really starts to create that one pane of glass for you to make informed decisions, both from a protection standpoint, but in the unfortunate event you have an incident, we can reference it for remediation activities as well.
So we've been talking a lot about these data elements and looking at this very structured format. Let's look at this from an unstructured perspective. I'm going to use the example of chicken soup. Probably a really nice one that most of us know about. But if I start to think about this from a manufacturing perspective, in this unstructured document, there are a number of elements up here that do fall underneath that sensitive information. I do a lot of work in manufacturing, medical devices, high-tech, aerospace. This stuff exists in an unstructured format. Documents, processes, procedures. As we look at this example, we can start to see that there's sensitive information in here from a data element that consistent with the data elements, and we're able to use that disposition framework to go out and find sensitive information in unstructured documents. From my experience, this is probably one of the biggest reasons why organizations are looking to control their information, because most of the information we're trying to chase down is unstructured information. So I'm just going to go through this quickly in terms of some of the different methods we've talked about. For those of you who aren't familiar with them, encryption's pretty straightforward. Encryption keys, symmetric or asymmetric keys. I can take the data, scramble it, make it unusable unless I have the key to unlock it. Tokenization and masking focus on leveraging an application level way of encrypting the data and making it viewable. Most of us have gone through the call with the customer service rep who says, give me your last four of your credit card number or social security number. That's masking. Tokenization takes the data and actually replaces it with a format preserving code that can be used to keep the data consistent, but at the same time that data is not traceable because the information is worthless. You can't uncrypt that code unless you have the key. Anonymization is where I take real data with fake data. So I use my name, Toby Zimmer, and I replace it with Bob Smith. It's still a name. The application doesn't care. It's a way that organizations use it to get better data analytics, keep the data in the same space, but at the same time, not expose personal information. The other aspect of this, for those of you who are familiar with census data, is generalization. I am 50 years old, I live in Parker, Colorado. Well, if I change that to I'm a Caucasian male who lives in the Denver metro area, and I'm age 50 to 55, that's a much bigger target. Versus instead of me being a single point in a 100,000 person town, I'm now a very large data set inside of a area of 4 million plus people. That's how generalization works. Those two last methods are typically performed using an application. This is classic encryption technology.
Yeah, and then can we just skip to the next one? Because I'm going to burn through this whole piece. So the thing that I think this is probably the most crucial component, there is an aspect of correlation that has to be done, especially when we're looking at structured databases in particular. For this example, right, the typical data elements across the top are the metadata that we're usually going to be looking for through a data discovery tool. They're usually going to be pretty agnostic. We can define what those parameters look like, but what happens when we run into database one, where we've got first name is literally first name, last name, gender, and then we go to database two and it's F name, L name, right? There is a component, especially if you're using a data discovery tool, it'll give you the metadata categories, but there is a component that usually, almost always, is a manual effort to correlate that. So for application A, or database one, we hit it one more time with that, there you go. For database one, right, okay, here are the headers, what first name looks like, what last name looks like, gender, so on and so forth, and then a mapping. So as you start to get a better understanding of your environment as a whole, we know what our metadata references are going to be in particular systems. It's not the hardest thing in the world, to be honest. A lot of people think it is a massive effort. Really, you're just looking at scans and correlating the headers, especially in the structured space. So this is something that's always very important to make sure that we are, when we talk about sensitivity levels, when we talk about controls, it's a like for like, right? We know that first name is first name, and what the reference column is going to be within a data table or application.
So, automating the destruction of data. Again, we're going to focus mostly on the unstructured space because this is where organizations struggle the most. First part about this is thinking about how do we identify this data? In the unstructured space, I'm going to look at this in two different aspects. One, I'm going to take a look at the file metadata. I want to understand, when was that file created? When was it last accessed? When was it last modified? That gives me an idea of, how relevant is this information? When's the last time it was used? There's a lot of stale data out there. I was working with a major university in California, and I was finding copies of their student data backups that were 12, 15 years old. Why do you have a backup that's 15 years old sitting on a file repository? It's not doing any good except exposing risk to you. Second aspect of this is leveraging tools to periodically discover this. We have to make this easier. Jordan was talking about some of the things, some of the approaches here. Data security posture management tools, data discovery tools. You can schedule these to actually go out and start to crawl your file repositories.
And then the big piece, right? Verifying. That's why we talk about having a cross-conglomerate group of individuals throughout the organization to verify, yeah, this data is not on legal hold, or yes, there's not a justification for retaining it beyond the retention schedule, and then starting to purge, right? So making sure to do that fact-checking step. Just a quick example, not on the retention side, from an access management standpoint, we're helping a large client do the verification, and we've kind of put this model in place where you would, once you've identified data that had some access control issues, here's the group you take it to for approval on what to do with it next. They did not heed that advice and just started cutting access and shut down a third of the organization for almost a week at $10 million a day. So, there's a lot to be said about making sure and verifying you can action data with a cross-conglomerate group of individuals, not making those decisions in a silo. So in a little bit about just the overall automating, looking at some of the stuff we talked about: last access date, last modified date, file creation, determining what is our triggering activity or metric, and then really leveraging data discovery. If you have worked with the data discovery tool, there's a lot of value that can be gleaned. There is no one tool is going to solve all the issues. There is a manual process, whether it be from the correlation standpoint or defining how that data is being used. But leverage the tools that are out there for as much as you can. And getting a good understanding of your overall footprint from a discovery standpoint really allows you to start building out what identified files are relevant for us and where do we need to start. And that's looking at some of the data or metadata within the context of that unstructured file and getting an idea of what your next actions are going to be.
So these tools, then, you can actually leverage them to actually move the data off. On-prem or in a cloud, if it's an unstructured file repository, you can take the data and redact it back, and send a notification out to that user. You can typically find out who that data owner is or the file owner and email them, let them know. Second part about this is the manual review process. You can also time gap this. Typically, I would tell an organization you give them 45 days, and after 45 days you can't determine what it is, get rid of it. From there, leverage utilities to destroy this stuff. There are some industry standards down here. These are things around DoD, His Majesty's governments, you name it. There are a number of industry-proven methods out there to digitally destroy data, make it untraceable and unusable. And then lastly, leverage the tools to go out and find it. Make sure it's done, it's gone, done and dusted.
Excellent. So closing remarks, right? I'm going to make this quick because I do want to save some time for Q&A. A lot of regulations out there, a lot of conflicting actual retention schedules and requirements, even just data management practices as a whole, right, beyond retention. So using that as the driver, really you need a cross-conglomerate group of individuals throughout the organization to make determinations. What is the remediation activity we're going to do on said data? And then obviously building a data disposition framework is one crucial piece to get that single pane of glass relates to master data management as a whole. But there's an aspect of doing it ongoing, right? So once you get it built, finding some ways to leverage or automate some of the data discovery work, doing some of the reporting, and being able to kind of track and monitor that overall function as opposed to one and done type of activity.
So, takeaways. In the next 2 weeks, think about what kind of information you have and who are the people who own it. It's a really important starting point of this. You visualize what that is and who they are and who owns it. It's going to give you a good way to start to have that conversation and have that dialogue with them. Within the next couple of months, sit down with them. Understand what those business processes are. What are those workflows they go through? How are they using this information? And being able to start to build out this disposition framework. You have a lot of information in this deck, and it's going to be really useful to help you take those next steps. The last part about this, in the next 6 months, think about how you can start to automate this. As Jordan pointed out, start small. I built disposition frameworks that had 400 elements in it. This was for a large retailer with multiple departments. Start small. Don't overcook this. And then start to leverage tools to start to do the automated discovery and destruction of it. So we got about 5 minutes left. What questions do you have? If you have anything, please step up to the mic, ask.
Am I on here? One of the things you mentioned was giving people more options so that they felt like they were more in control and more likely to adopt it. Is the other side of that, the cuts both ways kind of scenario, does that open up the potential for tagging things incorrectly though as well that could be equally as detrimental in the process of trying to build out your framework and control things?
Yes, I think, it's probably going to be a terrible thing to say in this room, but the delusion of choice is kind of what we're giving, right? That, if you look at the actual requirement from a retention standpoint, that's static. That is going to be it no matter what. Anything beyond 7 years, you're purging it, unless it's a legal hold or has a valid justification. But in that 1 to 7 year frame, giving them some options for how to manage it. The big kicker, right, is if we're going to be encrypting, we're going to be encrypting, right? It just kind of is what it is. So there are some components where when we talk about adoption, having that illusion of choice for how you're going to go put the controls in place creates a little better adoption than just pure dictations. So when we see like the 3-tiered option in particular, that's really designed to help get buy-in for it and advocacy for it, as opposed to creating a whole lot of really secondary options.
I mean, to kind of follow on to that without taking up too much time, is maybe, I find a lot of times just talking to my people and telling them the why, as opposed to just like, we need to do this, also helps. Maybe you don't need to give them as many options if you can get buy-in as to the why and why this is important to them and the company, and as opposed to give them more participation in it from that standpoint, like make them feel like they have ownership in it because it matters to them, as opposed to trying to give them more options to get their buy-in.
Yeah, that's very fair. And from that kind of executive buy-in stat that I gave earlier, that's a big piece. Like when we help people try to get this going, a lot of it's communication and training for what we're trying to accomplish, the reasoning behind it, the risk reduction for the organization, right? How it gains value for you as an individual. So that obviously is the kind of driving choice, is to train and really educate on the topic before we start. Doesn't always go that way, but yeah, I hear you loud and clear.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, my question is, what recommendations do you have for automating the retention policies?
So for automating retention policies, again, that's where you can use those data discovery tools to go out and crawl, particularly unstructured repositories, leverage those tools to identify based upon either file metadata or the sensitive information that's in the file, or both, and to be able to say if it meets this requirement, it exceeds a threshold where it has a last access date or last modified data greater than 3 years to 5 years, the tool will actually take the data and then move it to a quarantine folder. That's how you start to automate it. That validation process is a bit manual, but that's the best way to do it.
Okay. Do you know like any tool that has this capability?
Absolutely. Come up and ask us afterwards. I think we are out of time. So unfortunately, if you have questions, we'll step outside and talk some more. But thank you very much. Really appreciate you taking the time to hear us out today.
Thank you.